If you're listening to this podcast on YouTube, for a better experience, switch to the video version. The link is in the top right corner of the video and in the episode description. Hello and welcome, I'm Fernando, a GP in the UK. In today's episode, we look at the NICE updates published in February 2026, focusing on what is relevant in primary care only. This month, there's only one updated guideline relevant to us, but it's a major one, type 2 diabetes. A few months ago, we reviewed the draft versions of the guideline. Now that the final version has been published, over the next few weeks, I'll be creating separate episodes covering the different sections in more depth. So today, I'll just give you an overview, highlighting the difference between the draft, recommendations, and the final version. Right, let's jump into it. Firstly, let's have a look at the first-line treatment in people with no relevant comorbidities. In the draft guideline, NICE recommended starting metformin plus an SGLT2 inhibitor from the outset, with SGLT2 inhibitors monotherapy if metformin was not tolerated. The final guideline confirms this, but now it specifies that patients should be started on modified release metformin rather than just metformin. This change applies throughout the guideline. Wherever standard release metformin was recommended before, it now says modified release metformin. Is this the death of the standard release preparation? Possibly in the long term. Anyone starting treatment should now be on the modified release version, so numbers of standard release metformin will gradually fall. However, NICE also states that patients already on standard release metformin can continue or switch if necessary. Now let's look at the first-line treatment in specific clinical groups, starting with heart failure. In the draft guideline, the recommendation was metformin plus an SGLT2 inhibitor, and it suggested that semaglutide could be added for weight management in selected people with preserved ejection fraction and no frailty. In the final guideline is still modified release metformin plus an SGLT2 inhibitor with SGLT2 monotherapy if metformin is not tolerated. However, for people with heart failure who need further treatment, the guideline moves straight to adding a DPP4 inhibitor first, then a sulfonylurea or insulin if needed. There's no recommendation in this section to add a GLP-1 receptor agonist specifically for heart failure. Next is people with atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease. The draft guideline recommended early triple therapy with metformin plus an SGLT2 inhibitor plus semaglutide, continuing for cardiorenal benefit even if glycemic targets were not met. In the final guideline, this is confirmed but made more specific. Here we should offer modified release metformin plus an SGLT2 inhibitor plus subcutaneous semaglutide up to 1 mg once a week for cardiovascular, renal and glycemic benefits. If metformin is not tolerated, we will use an SGLT2 inhibitor plus semaglutide. It also explicitly recommends starting semaglutide if atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease develops at any stage after initial therapy. Next is the obesity group. In the draft guidelines, semaglutide was recommended after 3 months with additional filters such as preserved ejection fraction and no frailty. In the final guideline, NICE broadens this. It recommends either a GLP-1 receptor agonist or tirzepatide after at least 3 months of initial therapy if further treatment is needed. Now let's look at chronic kidney disease. There are 3 eGFR bands here, above 30, 20 to 30 and below 20. For eGFR above 30, we will use modified release metformin. SGLT2 inhibitors are still prioritized early for kidney and cardiovascular protection, and dapagliflozin and empagliflozin are specifically named because of licensing reasons. The 20 to 30 eGFR band is where we see a change. In the draft guideline, if eGFR was between 20 and 30, NICE advised offering dapagliflozin or empagliflozin alone. In the final guideline, it now says that if eGFR is 20 to 30, we should offer dapagliflozin or empagliflozin plus a DPP4 inhibitor. So this is now explicit dual therapy rather than SGLT2 monotherapy. The rationale explains why. If the eGFR is below 30, Cardiorenal protection of SGLT2 inhibitors remains, but the glucose-lowering effect is reduced, so a DPP-4 inhibitor is recommended for HbA1c control. For eGFR below 20, the draft recommended a DPP-4 inhibitor first, then considering pioglitazone or insulin, and it stated that sulfonylurea should not be used if eGFR was below 30. In the final guideline, it remains the same, a DPP-4 inhibitor first, and then pioglitazone or insulin. We need to be aware that the hypoglycemic risk of sulfonylureas increases as renal function falls. The draft also recommended not using empagliflozin or dapagliflozin if eGFR was less than 20. The final guideline does not phrase it that way. It simply directs us to DPP-4 inhibitors when eGFR is below 20. And now the final group is frailty. The draft guideline recommended metformin alone, effectively deprioritizing SGLT2 inhibitors, given that frailty increases SGLT2 inhibitor risks. In the final version, modified release metformin remains first line, but there's no automatic ban of SGLT2 inhibitors at baseline. Instead, the escalation sequence is first a DPP-4 inhibitor, and then consider pioglitazone, sulfonylurea or insulin, taking into account hypoglycemia and falls risk. Regarding GLP-1 receptor agonist and tirzepatide, the draft implied that they were generally inappropriate in frailty due to weight loss and gastrointestinal effects. However, the final guideline is more neutral. It does not specifically recommend them for frailty, but it states there is no inherent safety risk. If another indication exists, they can still be used even in frailty. Now let's have a look at some of the sections of the guideline. Looking at GLP-1 receptor agonists, the draft recommended stopping them if glycemic or weight goals were not achieved, unless the person had atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease or early onset diabetes. In the final guideline, NICE recommend stopping GLP-1 receptor agonists or tirzepatide if BMI falls below 18.5, or if they do not help with the glycemic targets as long as they're not being taken for cardiovascular benefit. So the emphasis shifts from weight thresholds towards glycemic targets and cardiovascular benefit. Regarding combining GLP-1 receptor agonists and DPP-4 inhibitors, both the draft and the final guideline advise against it. The final guideline also extends this to tirzepatide. In the insulin section, the draft stated that GLP-1 receptor agonists could be combined with insulin in primary care without specialist approval. The final guideline does not explicitly restate the specialist approval point. It simply states that when initiating insulin, we should continue metformin, stop other medicines used solely for glycemic control, and discuss continuing medicines used for cardiovascular protection or weight management. So that is it, a review of the NICE updates relevant to primary care. We have come to the end of this episode. Remember that this is not medical advice, but only my summary and my interpretation of the guidelines. You must always use your clinical judgment. Thank you for listening, and goodbye.